Justin, thanks very much for joining us. You're obviously Global Head of Research and Strategy there at AXA. And so it'd be interesting to get your perspective on the macro position and what you're seeing in the market.
I think we've reached an interesting juncture in the context of COVID-19 with progress around administering the vaccines, obviously at varying rates around the world. But I think it's very encouraging, and we can start to think about the reopening of these economies. I think the UK and US were first out of the gate, so to speak, in terms of ordering the vaccines. And so they're far advanced in terms of administering those, even if they've taken different strategies. The UK very much focusing on trying to get as much of the population with their first dose of the vaccination, whereas the US, by contrast, has been focusing on trying to get as much of the population fully vaccinated with both doses. But I think they're very much at the forefront of trying to reopen their economies as a consequence. And it's very encouraging, some of the anecdotes that we're seeing and hearing coming out of the US as the economies are reopening, with leisure travel going to places like Florida and the Caribbean at actually above pre-COVID levels. And I think it bodes well for what we're seeing on the continent in Europe. It's actually accelerated that trajectory in terms of vaccinations. So it's a pretty encouraging sign for the second half of the year. And I think we've got a very strong roadmap to recovery and reopening these economies.
And there's been a lot of focus on interest rates, inflation, and the influence of the pandemic on the general economic position. What's your sense of where we are at the moment, Justin?
I think from the interest rate side of things, we've had a tremendous amount of government and central bank policy support through combined and coordinated fiscal and monetary policy, respectively. And as a consequence of that, and the COVID-19 supply chain disruptions that we've seen over the course of the past 12 to 18 months, there's a bit of a disconnect in those supply chains that's leading to constraints in the manufacturing side of things, constraints on the commodity side of things, and just getting those inputs ready and prepared. And as a consequence of changing demand dynamics that have caught some industries, notably some of the construction and materials, wood, for example, a bit off guard and led to a significant increase in pricing there. And I think those are likely to be seen as transitory. And as a consequence, central banks around the world are looking beyond that. And I think they're going to allow these economies to reopen, inflation to run a little bit above target for the foreseeable future before they raise interest rates too much. I think there's been a significant amount of debt that's been permeating into the market, notably from the governments with their fiscal policy support. And as a consequence, any significant and swift increase in interest rates coming from the central banks raises insolvency concern. And I think they're acutely aware of those and are very cognizant of the pace by which they communicate any change in monetary policy and any subsequent increase in interest rates that would have, given the sheer amount of debt that's out there in the market, and servicing costs increasing too quickly and too high would raise insolvency concerns.
Looking at the real asset side, Justin, what are you seeing in terms of the market at the moment, and how are some of the economic factors beginning to influence the real estate sector?
Yeah, I think the biggest change in the macro picture has been the vaccination progress. The UK and US were quickest out of the gate. Europe is quickly accelerating and catching up. Ultimately, I think herd immunity is only going to be reached once not only we have those vaccines available, starting to get administered, but when we have enough of the population to be willing to accept those vaccines and be vaccinated. And I think that's where we've got some interesting dynamics playing out. And that is ultimately going to lead to the timing of and the ability for economies to reopen and all of the property sectors to recover. I think the UK has always had a very willing and able population to have the vaccines. The US in the 2020 time horizon was very reluctant, as was France. Look forward to today, and over the course of the past 3 or 4 months, the US population is becoming far more willing. France is extremely willing, closing the gap to Southern Europe and the UK, and Germany is somewhere in between. When we think about the property recovery prospects, that vaccination progress is critical. We've seen over the course of the COVID-19 pandemic a K-shaped sector prospect. Very significant, very clear divergence between the winners and losers. Those underpinned by structural, demographic, overall long-term thematics, such as residential, benefiting from the urbanization and demographic shifts occurring in these economies, looking at the e-commerce disruption that that's having on the retail sector and the supply chain infrastructure needing to be developed through additional warehouse, urban last mile facilities. Those have been the real clear winners in the pandemic, with high levels of robust demand, continued rental growth, and ultimately really a very high rent collection rate that hasn't seen much of a disruption during the COVID-19 pandemic. At the opposite end of the coin, you've got retail, you've got hospitality, those segments of the economy that rely on physical touch interaction, which obviously in the context of the pandemic has been a real challenge and has needed to be locked down. Now that we've got this vaccine progress, we've got a roadmap to recovery. With the willingness of populations, we've got hopes that we can reach herd immunity by the middle of this year, if not the second half of this year in some of the trailing European jurisdictions. That then allows us to bring this K full circle and start to see a more aligned V-shaped recovery with all of these segments coming back online.
Really interesting to catch up on that macro side. Thanks very much for joining us, Justin.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.